Moving over to video number 3 now, talking about Asperger's syndrome and non-verbal learning disability. How are these two disorders related to each other? By David Dinklage, PhD. So, possible symptoms of each diagnosis describe. It is possible that the symptoms of each diagnosis describe the same group from different perspectives. For example, Asperger's syndrome from a behavioural perspective, and non-verbal learning disability from a neuropsychological testing perspective. The specific conventions of these diagnoses may lead to somewhat different. The specific conventions of these diagnoses may lead to somewhat different groups meeting diagnostic criteria, but it is not clear that this reflects something true in nature. Studies conducted by Yale Child Study Group suggest that up to 80% of children who meet criteria for Asperger's syndrome also have non-verbal learning disability. And it is most likely that children with the more severe forms of non-verbal learning disability also have Asperger's. Both groups are socially awkward and pay over attention to details and parts, while missing the main themes. But by convention, the two groups differ in a range of severity. Asperger's syndrome is a diagnosis for those with more severe social impairment and behavioural rigidity, and some of their symptoms may overlap with high-functioning autism. There are degrees of severity within Asperger's. The degrees of severity range from extreme autistic behaviour to cases where social difficulties are very subtle and the academic cognitive difficulties are more prominent. Non-verbal learning disability criteria focuses on academic issues and test findings. For different means of making a diagnosis, there are different means of making a diagnosis, either testing for NVLD versus observing for Asperger's, but they both might be describing the same group of children from different angles. Non-verbal learning disability involves intact, linear, detail-oriented, automatic processing with impaired appreciation of the big picture. There is often visual-spatial deficits. The pragmatic use of language is impaired. The rote recall of story is good, but the main point is often missed. Attention is often impaired. They do not know what to attend to, but once they are focused, they can sustain attention to detail. Inferential reading comprehension is weak relative to decoding and spelling skills. Maths is often the first academic subject to be viewed as problematic. Peer relations are an area of impairment. They often play with older or younger children. They often do not make eye contact and can be oblivious to other people's reactions. They display a lack of empathy and social judgment, and this may shield them from fully experiencing the hurt of peer rejection. Yeah, interestingly, when I was a kid, I was rejected by my peers, but I was so in my own little bubble, it didn't really affect me negatively, although others were aware of it, so that's interesting. They also have rigid routines. It is not just the IQ discrepancy, which is important, because there can be other reasons for an IQ discrepancy other than non-verbal learning disability. And non-verbal learning disability can be present, even if no IQ discrepancy is there. Also, one does not need to have every characteristic in dramatic form for a diagnosis to be helpful in delineating a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Because Asperger's diagnosis is descriptive, one does not need neuropsychological testing to diagnose it. However, since so much overlap between Asperger's and NVLD, testing is highly recommended. This will identify any interference with academic functioning and can confirm the imbalances in thinking skills that may have been observed. The author has seen a number of children with Asperger's syndrome who would not meet the criteria for NVLD in previous research studies. If included in the Yale study, there would probably have been in the 20% of Asperger's who do not meet the NVLD criteria. They may have had high visual spatial scores, thus masking their over-attention to detail in problem solving. For example, they may have scored very high on block design subtest, using colour blocks to match pattern given to them, despite having no appreciation of the big picture. Their speed at analysing detail would have allowed them to use this inefficient strategy effectively. So with the very bright ones, the test may not be sensitive enough to discern a pattern of NVLD. And some with Asperger's syndrome show diffuse difficulties in language and attention, but may not exhibit pronounced discrepancies associated with NVLD. A case example illustrates how children who have NVLD may not meet criteria for Asperger's. For example, there was one girl who had maths difficulties. She had a 24-point discrepancy between verbal and visual spatial on IQ. She had no problems with inferential comprehension in reading, So no one could consider Asperger's, because obviously problems with inferential comprehension, like what I had, and that was picked up very early, can be like a real hallmark sign of Asperger's as well. But this person didn't have those reading comprehension problems. She also made good friends. She also had many good friends that were and she felt part of her peer group. She had no repetitive behaviours. This is unusual in NVLD as well. But as the criteria are cognitive and test-based, she met enough criteria for NVLD, but not for Asperger's. Most children with NVLD have more social problems than this, and they also often have reading comprehension problems. But however, when she went to senior school, things became different. She was now isolated from her peers, and her papers were more like lists and less integrated than those of her peers. Her NVLD was subtle and required more high-powered peer and academic demands to highlight her social perception and inferential reasoning weaknesses. She was never diagnosed with Asperger's, but as she had good social adjustment. Still, one has to wonder whether neurocognitive functioning indicated Asperger's, but in a much milder form. Asperger's syndrome was not originally thought of as having a continuum of severity that included subtle forms, whereas NVLD did not start with the assumption that there were more extreme difficulties. As more subtle cases are being identified, the culture is changing the original intention of the category, and this may dilute the clarity of diagnosis. Which is kind of what I was saying before. I think maybe some of these really, really mild cases that are now getting diagnosed, like Melanie Sykes, maybe actually just have a broader non-verbal learning disability and aren't actually autistic, even if they share some symptoms. It's kind of saying more or less the same thing. It's also interesting, by the way, that there's reference to one individual who has a verbal score of 110 and a performance of 60. That's very similar to what mine was at school, although mine was even lower. My non-verbal, I can't remember exactly what it was around 53 or something, very low.